Welcome to today's discussion on whether Congress should swipe left on the Credit Card Competition Act. My name is Christian Stout. I'm the Director of Innovation Policy at the International Center for Law and Economics. Senators Richard Durbin and Roger Marshall recently introduced the Credit Card Competition Act, which would effectively enable merchants to route credit card transactions over a network other than the main one affiliated with a payment card. The sponsors say that this will increase competition and reduce costs for merchants who will pass on the savings to consumers. But are Durbin and Marshall being overly optimistic? Have they perhaps missed some predictable but unintended consequences that might cause their act to harm rather than help consumers? To help answer these questions, we have two leading experts who have looked at experiences in the US and around the world with similar routing mandates and have drawn on these to assess the likely effects of the proposed new routing mandates on the American economy. I'm very pleased to be joined by Todd Zawicki, who is the George Mason University Foundation Professor of Law at George Mason University Antonin Scalia School of Law, a research fellow of the Law and Economics Center, and former executive director of the GMU Law and Economics Center. In 2020 to 2021, he served as the chair of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau Task Force on Federal Consumer Financial Law, and in 2021, he was inducted into the American College of Consumer Financial Services Lawyers. Julian Morris is a senior fellow at the International Center for Law and Economics. Before joining ICLE, Julian was vice president of research at Reason Foundation, and prior to that, he was executive director of International Policy Network, director of the Environment and Technology program at the Institute of Economic Affairs, and a visiting professor at the University of Buckingham. Julian is an expert in law and economics of regulation and has written extensively on the regulation of payment card networks. I have several questions lined up to start the discussion, and we'll begin with those. After about 30 minutes, I will invite questions from the audience, which I will incorporate into the discussion. If you do have a question, please submit it using the Q&A feature. We ask that you include your name and affiliation with your question. First, I think it would be helpful to do some table setting. We'd like to understand what this is all about. How does the CCCA relate to what the Durbin Amendment did, and how does that relate to the experiences we've seen over the last decade or so? Julian, why don't we start with you?
So in the Durbin Amendment to the Dodd-Frank Act, the Durbin Amendment did two things. First of all, it imposed price controls on interchange fees for banks with assets over $10 billion. Secondly, it introduced a routing mandate for debit cards that were for all debit cards, so requiring at least two networks to be present on each debit card. What we know about these things we'll discuss later, but the current proposal, the Credit Card Competition Act, so-called, would impose a somewhat similar routing mandate on credit cards to the routing mandate that was introduced on debit cards under the Durbin Amendment. But it would, in a way, it's worse because the routing mandate says that you must have at least two networks active on the card. That means at least Visa, for example, and another network. But the other network cannot be one of the two main networks. So the two main networks are Visa and MasterCard. What this means is that on each credit card, if this legislation were to pass, it would be necessary for issuers to have if they have a main network, if they had, for example, Visa or MasterCard, then they would have to have one of the smaller networks also activated on the card and usable by merchants. So that's the basic proposition here, and we can go into the implications of that in a minute.
Okay, and it could help our listeners, our viewers, to understand who are the major players that are involved in this potential regulation.
I mean, so the big drivers of this have been the big box merchants who have complained over and over about high interchange fees. Now, the interchange fee is the fee that's charged effectively by the issuing bank to the merchant acquirer to cover various different costs. Again, we can go into the details, but I mean, among the other costs that are covered are the costs of addressing security, so making sure that the card network remains secure, that you can prevent fraud and so on. It also enables the card issuer to cover the costs of granting owners of the card rewards that they've offered. So it helps incentivize people to adopt certain cards or use certain cards when they make certain transactions. So interchange fees have become a mainstay of card networks and have been so really since they were first established in the 1950s. And they help maintain the networks, and they help incentivize the consumers to adopt the cards. And of course, if there's more consumers that adopt the cards, then more merchants will want to be participants in the network as well. So there's a good sort of reason why interchange fees exist and are used to balance, if you like, the different interests in the networks. Unfortunately, the one part of the merchants who overall have benefited from these payment cards by having more transactions take place. One group of those, especially the larger big box merchants, have been pushing over and over and again for lower fees. Now, when they do that privately, when they make negotiations with the card networks, that's all fine, no problem at all. It's a private agreement. The card networks can balance the interests according to what they think is right. The problem arises when those big box merchants push for restrictions imposed by government, because that changes the way that the networks are able to balance the two sides of this market, the merchants and the consumers, and has various adverse consequences that we've written about before in the context of the Durbin Amendment and in the context of what's happening in Europe and what's happening in Australia. But again, I don't want to go into too much detail now.
That's actually a good transition to what I wanted to ask you next. You two, as I mentioned, you two have written a paper that reviews the effects of interchange fee regulations and more recently on the potential damage that routing mandates can cause. I think it would be good to go into some of the top level findings and empirical results of that paper with our audience. Todd, why don't we start with you?
Thanks, Christian. So there's so one of the big misnomers is Julian has suggested is that this is that the logic of this is a Main Street versus Wall Street type ideal. And one of the things that's striking about this is that this time around, Senator Durbin has managed to persuade Republicans to come along for the ride. In particular, Kansas Senator Roger Marshall is a co-sponsor, based on this idea that this is to promote competition, which we'll come back to in a minute, which is Julian noted was the second part of the Durbin Amendment. Now, the reason this is not Main Street versus Wall Street is that there are clear winners and losers of this. The winners, as Julian noticed, are going to be big box retailers. The reason is the way they negotiate their interchange fees. They tend to be able to, they basically have cost basis pricing, which basically as their costs go down, their merchant discount fees go down. Whereas smaller merchants tend not to have that same sort of pricing. And so the big box retailers, big retailers tend to see bigger savings than small Main Street retailers. But there are two key aspects to this. The first is that consumers will be the ones who inevitably end up biting the bullet on this, and in particular, low-income consumers. This spring, Julie and I published a paper prior to the current one on routing, where we looked at what the Durbin Amendment had wrought for consumers. And what we saw was obviously it reduced interchange fee revenues to merchants. And that is the whole purpose. The whole purpose of this regulation, this new intervention, is to reduce the level of interchange fees that merchants have to pay. And so everything we saw with the Durbin Amendment is a first approximation with respect to what ends up happening when you reduce interchange fees through forcible government intervention is going to happen here. And what do we see with the Durbin Amendment, which imposed price controls on debit cards? What we saw was interchange fee revenues went down for banks. Banks passed on somewhere in the range of 40 to 70% or more of those lost revenues to consumers. How did they do that? First, the access to free checking fell dramatically. It basically was cut in half as a result of the Durbin Amendment, but it was cut in half in a particular way. Who ended up eating the Durbin Amendment was low-income consumers. Why? Because the first way in which banks tried to recoup the revenue loss from interchange fee price controls was by raising the mandatory minimum balance necessary in order to be eligible for free checking. And obviously, that adversely impacts lower income consumers more than others. A paper by Sarin and Mukhar estimates, for example, that that free checking would have been 81% higher, especially for lower income consumers. Without the Durbin Amendment, we estimated earlier that maybe 1 million people became unbanked because they lost access to free checking. The second thing we saw was that bank fees dramatically went up for those who are no longer eligible for free checking. We know how this will play out in the credit card context. If this regulation has, and remind you, this is the intended consequence, not the unintended consequence. The intended consequence of this regulation is to reduce interchange fees. And we know how this is going to play out for issuers and then consumers, which is consumers are we're going to see an increase. We're going to see a return of annual fees, most likely, as we've seen in other countries, as Julian will talk about. We will see an elimination of rewards, which is what we saw after the first Durbin Amendment. Debit card rewards disappeared for consumers. And the last half of that is there's no evidence that any significant amount of the savings from the Durbin Amendment, now over a decade later, were passed on to consumers. A trivial amount, if any, was passed on to consumers versus the large pass through of losses, bank revenues by banks. So the first thing that will happen is low income consumers are going to probably lose access to credit cards. People are going to lose access to free credit cards. Rewards are going to go down. And in fact, verifying that, one of the groups that has spoken out against this is the airlines have sent a letter to the members of Congress saying that if this legislation goes through, it'll prove devastating, and they will most likely have to either eliminate or curtail frequent flyer rewards cards. So if you like those cards, you should be against this legislation. The second thing this will do in a more complicated way is routing, as Julian said at the outset, is technical. It's not often understood, but it turns out it is the heart of the interchange fee system, which is that the whole network of security, processing, access to data to be able to develop better and more nimble security to protect fraud and that sort of thing depends on having access to data. What this will do and is intended to do is fragment data as it passes through the system to route data to issuers that consumers may not have as much confidence in. Consumers have a lot of confidence in Visa and MasterCard. And when consumers choose providers because they have confidence in them, that is a success of competition, not a failure of competition. And so what we could end up with here is a less reliable credit card network, more fraud, less access to the data necessary for this whole system to run. The final party that will be upset by this, in addition to consumers, is small banks. It is not a coincidence that the Kansas Bankers Association, which, newsflash, is not JP Morgan and Goldman Sachs, has come out against this legislation. There was just an op-ed the other day from the Dade County Federal Credit Union coming out against this legislation because they understand that small issuers are going to be clobbered by these provisions. Big issuers have multiple different revenue streams. Big issuers cater to high income, high wealth customers. They'll sell more investment advice and mortgages and everything else. Smaller issuers are going to find their credit card networks, their credit card issuance perhaps to be unsustainable because they just don't have as many alternative revenue streams to fall back on, and they don't have the deep and broad base among very high income, high wealth consumers like large banks do. So that's the reason why small banks have been the most vocal opponents of this legislation.
Julian, could you expand a little further on what the secondary impacts, apart from the effect directly on interchange fees, would be? Things like the impacts on security that Todd briefly mentioned.
Well, so actually, I'll start with this chart, which I think is helpful in understanding kind of why this is going to affect interchange fee revenue. So this chart shows the change in interchange fee revenue on covered and exempt issuers under the Durbin Amendment. So a covered issuer is a bank with assets of over 10 billion. An exempt issuer is one with assets below 10 billion. So, and the crucial line here is the yellow line. The yellow line is the interchange fee charged by exempt issuers following the Durbin Amendment on their PIN network, on the single message network. And as you can see, although it doesn't fall immediately, it falls gradually, almost to the same level as the level mandated under Durbin for the covered issuers. So that this shows that by imposing a routing mandate where there is existing competition, you get this revenue effect, you get this price effect as the issuers are forced effectively to allow the merchants to route via different networks, and in this case they're routing not over the networks that they would prefer to, but over different PIN networks, and the major PIN networks were then forced to lower their prices. So there is competition in a sense over these networks as a result, but the competition is destructive competition, not constructive. It reduces interchange fees, which means that the networks do not have the same resources to invest in improving the technologies and so on. And we've seen in Durbin, we saw a delay in the rollout of new technologies as a result of this, both by the exempt issue, both by the covered issuers and by the exempt issuers. So there's no doubt this had a detrimental effect. So I'll stop showing that, but I'll now briefly sort of go into some of these very important effects. So Todd mentioned that there would be an adverse effect on the amount of data that's routed over particular networks. This is almost certainly going to be the case. So right now, Visa and MasterCard in particular are basically in control of the data as it enters the system until it goes when it goes from the merchant acquiring bank to the issuing bank. They have a broad control over that data. It flows over their networks. As a result, they're able to identify instances of fraud. Since the 90s, both companies have invested billions of dollars in machine learning systems that enable them better to identify instances of fraud that otherwise wouldn't be identified. If you fragment the data that's currently going over those networks, you make it more difficult for them to identify instances of fraud. And to the point where actually, if they don't have the access to the data, there may be instances of fraud they just completely aren't aware of. So they can't integrate that into their machine learning algorithms, but also they can't help the issuer in identifying that specific instance of fraud. So that's a basic concern that there isn't a simple solution to right now, and is not being addressed by the legislation, so far as I'm aware. So that's a pretty significant concern. On top of that, there is, I think, a legitimate concern that there would be a free riding effect. So, for example, that some of the larger merchants can avoid this. They can avoid this because they can know who their customers are. So they can do that in various ways. So they can start by running the initial transactions by a particular customer over the major networks, so that they can then evaluate whether that customer is a worthy customer or not, or should be subject to additional fraud investigation. Once they've done that, once they've sort of verified the customer, they can then, in subsequent transactions, run the customer over a less protected network, a less well fraud protected network. So it works fine for those very large merchants who are able to identify their specific customers, whether it's through some other separate reward system or a membership program. But for the smaller merchants, they're not going to be able to do that. So they're going to carry on relying, I would presume, on the major networks. So you'll then have actually a price differential effect, where the smaller merchants end up continuing to use the major networks. The larger merchants are able to manipulate the system, so that reduces their costs. So this is really going to hit the smaller merchants, on top of which we'll probably see effects similar to what we saw with Durbin, and in other jurisdictions, where you have right now the credit card networks offer lower fees for small ticket items. But if we have this overall reduction in interchange fees, as would be expected, then and has happened with the Durbin Amendment, with the interchange fee regulations in the EU, and with regulations in Australia, what you'll see almost certainly is an averaging up of those fees, so that smaller ticket items are subject to higher interchange fees than they are today. So again, you're hitting especially the small merchants who sell a lot of small ticket items.
Interesting. And that leads to the next topic I want to talk about, which is competition. But before we do that, I just want to remind the audience, if they have questions, please put them into the Q&A function of the chat. We've gotten a couple in. I'll ask those after my last topic. But if you have your question, now it's time to submit it, so we make sure we get to it. So based on what the two of you just talked about, it sounds like there's pretty varied competition dynamics that affect both merchants and credit card network competition in the credit card market and the debit card market. I thought it would be helpful if perhaps you could unpack that a little bit further, the competition dynamics, if you want to go first, Todd.
Yeah, and this is an important point, which is the structure of competition in the debit card market versus the credit card market is fundamentally different. And this is important to understand, which is most people carry one debit card. From their issuing bank. Now, that doesn't mean that the Durbin Amendment made any sense or that there was a market failure in the debit card market. But what that does mean is that the idea of requiring at least two networks, two routing systems on one card is completely different from the credit card network. In the credit card network, the average consumer has, I think, 4 credit cards. Most people have 4 or 5 credit cards. By the time you've actually pulled out your credit card to make the purchase, you have already had competition. And that's the point, is to then require additional routing networks on top of, if you've chosen to use your Visa card or your MasterCard or your American Express card or your China Union Pay card, whatever, if that's your taste, you've already made that decision by the time you've gone to the pump, gotten to the grocery store checkout or whatever. And so the idea that there is some failure in the credit card market is just simply incorrect. We know that consumers carry multiple cards. It's easy to get new cards for most people. And so I think that people really need to be careful about understanding the different dynamics of competition in these two markets.
Julian, do you have any thoughts you want to add to that topic?
I mean, I think Todd spelled it out really quite clearly. I mean, just to reiterate, calling this the Credit Card Competition Act is a total misnomer. This is not about promoting competition per se. This is about basically imposing a routing mandate on issuers that will cause a reduction in interchange fees and cause a reduction in consistency of access to important data. So it'll have these adverse effects. It'll result in the greater difficulty in covering costs. So actually, one example of this is right now, a vast proportion of consumers have reward cards. Many of those reward cards are also co-brand cards. So, for example, you might have a store co-branded card, or you might have a hotel co-branded card, or you might have an airline co-branded cards. A significant proportion of the interchange fee on those cards goes towards covering the rewards associated with them. If you force the major issuers to route via different networks and thereby significantly reduce interchange fees, you're going to dramatically reduce rewards. You will probably kill a lot of those co-branded cards. So anybody who has an airline rewards card that enables them to get additional miles to travel in vacations, that will go under this rule, which is kind of it's going to be an adverse effect. So you're actually undermining, just to say, you're undermining competition. I mean, right now you have competition in the supply of credit cards. You have enormous numbers of different cards are issued by enormous numbers of different banks with many different co-brands and different reward structures. This incentivizes people to choose the card, as Todd said, that is most appropriate for the particular transaction that they're undertaking. But it also just incentivizes people to use credit cards, which overall is a good thing. It's a good thing for the consumer because it enables them to defer payment, even if most people actually don't use the credit function of a credit card, in the sense they don't defer payment beyond the automatic payment date. So they're getting 6 weeks or so on average of free credit through this, which is obviously paid for somehow. How's it paid? By the interchange fee. So that's a good thing for the consumer, and it also is a good thing for merchants because it increases the amount of sales. So if you're going to hit the interchange fee, you're going to hit those incentives. You're going to reduce the use of credit cards. You're going to use availability of credits. You're going to harm poorer consumers who will end up having to pay an annual fee on cards that currently don't have an annual fee, and they're going to get fewer rewards. They're not going to be able to have rewards for paying for hotels, paying for airfares to go and visit their loved ones. They're not going to have rewards for buying basic groceries from their store program. So these things are all going to go away, or at least be massively reduced. How you can say that this is an enhancement of competition, I don't know. It's an offence against the word competition, I think.
Well, this
And
would
just
not
to
be.
if I may, Christian, just to amplify Julian's point, what we know is that getting rid of awards is effectively a price increase, right? Whether it's cash back, whether it's miles or whatever. And so having to pay more for a credit card in terms of annual fees, that's a price increase. In the middle of a situation in which Americans' most important issues right now are inflation, especially lower income consumers, is a very curious time to adopt a regulation that will increase prices for using a credit card. And the evidence on this is abundantly clear and overwhelming at this point, that the increase in cost on the financial institution side to consumers is much larger than any speculative pass-through that retailers pass through in terms of lower prices to consumers. And to the extent they do pass it through, it's smaller, and it tends to take a lot longer period of time. So we're effectively, this law is effectively an indirect price increase during a period of record inflation, which seems like an odd choice to make.
I mean, just to reinforce that as well, there's a not inconsiderable chance that the US, in fact, most of the world, will go into recession in the coming year. We know that during recessions, people rely more on credit cards. They're an important fallback for many people. If you impose this requirement on routing, then you will reduce interchange fees. By reducing interchange fees, you force the credit card issuers to recover fees in other ways. One other way that been adopted in many other jurisdictions, Australia, Europe, and so on, is by increasing the default interest rate on credit cards. So you're going into recession, you're forcing, look, almost certainly some people who are going to have to pay interest on their credit cards to pay more interest. That really seems unwise.
And I'll just add, I mean, it's curious timing for another reason, which is literally our payment network saved the economy during the pandemic lockdown, right? If there has ever been a situation that proves the value of ubiquitous access to reliable, efficient, secure payment networks, innovative payment networks, it was during the pandemic, where essentially the entire economy shifted from in-person to virtual overnight. It basically proved itself. And now we're going to come in, and it seems just like an odd time to fiddle with the system that is clearly not broken, as we learned over the next few years, and to do things that reduces access to credit cards, that makes it more expensive, as we already did with respect to debit cards, just seems very wrongheaded.
Yeah, well, it would not be the first time Congress passes or tries to pass an act that the title of it has the opposite effect of what its actual real world implications would be. To one of the points you just made at the end of the last round of reinforcing each other there, Todd, we actually have one of our first questions is about what the numbers say, if you could get a little more specific about how what the result of Durbin 1.0 was in terms of passing on cost savings to consumers, because it was floated and the current provision is being floated as a way to save consumers money. You both have touched on the fact that consumers didn't save money. Can you be more specific about what the magnitude of the passing or not passing on of cost savings was?
Absolutely. And Julian and I, this spring, as I mentioned, wrote a 36-page paper, I believe it is, which is focused precisely on this particular question. So we go through all the research, including our own research on this, and we break it down, and we talk about the elimination of rewards. We talk about increases in cost in that sort of thing, increases in bank fees, and that sort of thing. And so I'll refer the reader to that because I think it might actually kind of be tedious to go through the 6 or so studies that have been done already on this particular topic. But the overall effect is basically, as I said, the net is probably the best ballpark estimate is about 40 to 80%, 40 to 70% of revenue losses were passed through to consumers in terms of elimination of free checking. And again, lower income consumers were the ones that were impacted the most by this. Some estimates are, I believe it was a Federal Reserve paper, as high as 90% of the revenue from debit interchange fees was passed through to consumers in terms of higher bank fees and the like. On the other hand, there's been a couple studies, including a notable study by the Fed, a study by Sarah Namuk-Arloff, who really dug into the data with respect to pass through by merchants. And they were essentially able to find virtually no difference, virtually no evidence of any pass through by merchants. To the extent that merchants actually saw a reduction in cost, as Julian alluded to, small merchants, it's not even clear the extent to which they saw these get passed through to them as opposed to being captured by the acquirer. To the extent that they passed it through, they basically did not pass it. To the extent they received benefits, they did not pass it through to consumers. This is not unique in the United States, as Julian has noted. This experiment has been on both price controls and routing mandates, has been replicated all over the world, and the results are constantly the same, which is consumers get higher bank fees, they get less access to rewards or less generous rewards. A lot of countries don't even have sort of much access to free checking like we have, so it's really just increased bank fees. And again, what we see is no evidence of merchant pass through to consumers. And there's a lot of economic theory. We talk about in the paper on why that is, but it basically has to do with the structure of competition in these markets. And it has to do with the fact that for merchants, this is a very small component that tends not to get passed through. Whereas for banks, it's one large lump sum loss with respect to each of their consumers. And so that just tends to, those large chunks tend to get passed through more directly to consumers.
And I'll note that paper we didn't include in the invitation. I'm going to see if I can figure out how to drop a link to that in the chat here. But if, the original invitation email, if you want to reply to that and ask for a copy, if I'm not able to do that during this this webinar, we'd be happy to forward you a copy of that paper. That
I'll put it in the chat right now. So
okay, that'd be great.
Okay.
Yeah. Another question we had asking for a little more elaboration on some of the points you touched on. Could you describe the downstream effects for small banks from the routing requirements, not interchange caps, since the thresholds are $100 billion for the routing requirements? That's for either of you. So we want to know about the effects on small banks from routing requirements.
Yeah, I think this is very poorly drafted legislation, but I think that question misunderstands the legislation as I understand it. That $100 billion thing is basically designed to close the American Express loophole, which is the way this is structured is it applies to networks and issuers, right? Mm-hmm. And Visa and MasterCard are considered four-party networks with respect to this. So my understanding is any card issued under a Visa or MasterCard brand would be required to have a second network on it that cannot be the other one. If it's Visa, it can't be MasterCard. It could be, these various PIN networks that have been trying to get into this market. It could be China Union Pay. That could be added to the card if you want China Union Pay on your card. I guess you can like this legislation, but any card issue. My understanding is any card issued by those networks, regardless of the issuer, would be impacted. And then it would also apply to any issuer of over 100 billion in assets, which I believe is American Express and maybe Discover. They would not count in terms of the big two, but they would count in terms of their cards, I believe, would have to have the additional routing on it. Do I have that correct, Julian?
I think that's absolutely correct. And I would just add that it also would make it more difficult, probably prevent some of the other large banks, JP Morgan and so on, Citibank, from creating their own networks, right, and circumventing this by doing that. So this really is, it's actually the 100 billion threshold really is just a mechanism for forcing this to mess with the system as much as possible. So contrary to it, those people who are reading this and saying, well, this doesn't apply to banks other than those with more than 100 billion are misunderstanding the actual way that it operates.
And that would include
apply to all issuing banks. There's no,
I think that would include then, and like if Google started issuing its own credit card, or somebody like that, right? Would my understanding would be captured under the 100 billion, even if they were not considered a network for purposes of the law.
Yeah, exactly.
So we have one last question in our Q&A right now, which I'll ask shortly. But if someone in the audience wants to ask another question, now's the time to put it in, because if not, we'll wrap up with this last question. This one's a little bit more reading the tea leaves. You may not have a good answer for us because it's up to anyone's guess in a sense. But what is the likelihood of this passing in some fashion, either as an amendment to the omnibus? There was an attempt to put it on the defense reauthorization. What are the chances it gets through in the lame duck session of Congress? What's your sense of this bill going forward?
Yeah, and I think it is hard to read the tea leaves, but the history of this is interesting, which is the first Durbin Amendment was jammed through in a midnight amendment to Dodd-Frank, which is originally, it actually started off with a $1 billion threshold, and they switched it to a $10 billion threshold for the price controls just because somebody said, well, that's too many banks, essentially, right? It was just, nobody was talking about anything as radical as the Durbin Amendment prior to Dodd-Frank, but it got jammed through as part of Dodd-Frank. And I think that basically what happened was, since that time, some people who maybe voted for it have had some degree of buyer's remorse now that they've seen how consumers have been hammered by the Durbin Amendment, and how it has been so bad for consumers. And so now the same crowd is back at the trough, and they're pushing this. And I think, you know, they're talking about attaching it to various other pieces of legislation, which makes you wonder whether they've got 60 plus votes, right, to get past a filibuster for this particular law, notwithstanding Republican co-sponsorship. And so it seems to, and so it's kind of hard to say what would happen, but that at least the fact that they're pushing it on these other things could either just indicate that they can't get floor time for it, you know, and they may revisit in the lame duck session, or that maybe the votes aren't there for it, but if they attach it to defense reauthorization or some other sort of thing, that they may be able to push it through, much like they pushed through the original Durbin Amendment in the dark of night, without any real debate or deliberation over what the full implications of it might be.
Interesting. Any thoughts on that you want to add, Julian?
I mean, I don't have any greater insight. I would say that if there is any impetus to consider this legislation, it would be better for the American people if it is reviewed in full by all of Congress, rather than pushed through as a rider to another must pass bill. There's acres and acres written about the problems of those kinds of riders, and you know, the world would be a better place if each piece of legislation was passed on its own merits rather than added to other pieces of legislation. Although you always get log rolling, right, at some level, but making it inclusive to a bill seems like just as a principle, a bad thing, regardless of the merits of this particular piece of legislation.
And again, Durbin itself was wrong-headed, right? Obviously, and had unintended consequences. But the case for this legislation is even less sensible than the Durbin Amendment, for the reasons I said, which is there is so much competition in credit card networks. You know, we talked about, you know, there's at least 4 major networks. There's store branded cards, right? There's so much competition. Competition happens at the moment when cards are issued and consumers decide which card to use. There's the golden rule of intervention is first identify a market failure. And here, there's simply no market failure that I think can really be identified here that has anything to do with competition. And so to try to ram this thing through without a full study and thought of what the unintended consequences would be for consumers as we head into a stagflationary period of high inflation and a recession is just really not it's exactly the kind of legislation that warrants further study and consideration before it just gets pushed through based on some populist rhetoric and a vague hand wave towards the concept of competition.
I would also just add, we didn't include this in the paper, but Todd and I previously documented how, as a result of Durbin, consumers shifted from using debit to using credit cards. So credit cards are competition for debit cards, and they were kind of, in a sense, they acted as a valve, enabling people to keep on accessing rewards that they had previously had on their debit cards. So they shifted to using credit cards, which they paid off each month. And if you impose this restriction, you actually reduce that competition. It's just straightforward reduction in competition. So this, again, this idea that this is somehow pro-competition or pro-competitive, very bizarre.
Well, on that thought, we don't have any more questions in our queue. I think those are pretty good summaries of where we're at with the Credit Card Competition Act. I want to thank our panelists for joining us today. This is Todd Zawicki and Julian Morris. We have a link to the interchange fee paper that they were talking about from the spring in our chat here. Again, though, if you want to respond to your original email and ask for it, we can send it. And the routing paper was also attached, or the link to it was attached in that original email. Want to thank everybody for joining us today. And if you have any questions, please feel free to respond to your invitations and we will follow up with you. Thank you.